Welcome to Change Management Global Connect 2023. You will be listening to the following presentation, Global Change Management Pitfalls and Best Practices, presented by Miriam Huss and Thomas Tischer. In today's presentation, we'll go over an introduction to change management with its definition and the stages and resistance of change. We will then go over cultural factors and pitfalls with some definition around diversity and cross-cultural organizations, as well as change management pitfalls and mitigations. And we will finish with change management best practices, with how to lead global change management initiatives, what would be the best practices, and a case study. So, welcome everyone. My name is Miriam Huss. I'm the founder and CEO of Axum Consulting, a management consulting firm based out of Chicago, Illinois, in the United States. I was born and raised in France, hence the French accent. And a little bit about me, I try to visit at least one new city or country per year. And I love good food. So during the global pandemic, I started a food blog with my kids. So feel free to go there. It's called KerryandEliasCuisine.com. Now I will hand over to my colleague Thomas Tischer, who will introduce himself and start the presentation.
Thank you, Mariam. I am Thomas Tischer, and I will be one of your speakers today. I'm a consultant by profession, and I focus on working with organizations to assist them in identifying and implementing organizational development initiatives. While I've worked on different types of projects, my expertise is focused on change management, organizational design, and learning and development. Over the past few years, I had the pleasure to work with clients in various industries and on a global scale. A few facts about me. I am French American as well, with half of my family being American and the other half being French. I love learning new things, and lately teaching myself to play piano has been my new hobby. In my free time, I enjoy traveling and having new experiences, and I hope to have visited all the US states in a few years. Before we begin digging deeper into global change management pitfalls and best practices, I would like to spend some time reviewing what change management is. There are a lot of definitions out there explaining what change management is and is not. We define it as the process, tools, and technique that are used to manage the people's side of change to achieve business results. In today's world, organizations face changes on a regular basis. Just to cite a few reasons, it can be due to technologies or work function evolving, to new generation entering the workplace, or to organizations having to innovate to remain competitive within their industry. Whatever the rationale of the change may be, it is critical to consider the impact that any changes will have on different processes, systems, and employees within an organization. Overlooking any of these dimensions, prior to or during a change, can negatively impact the success of the change initiative and ultimately the effectiveness and productivity of the organization putting it in place. It is then critical to have a sound management strategy that follows best practices to avoid falling in different change management pitfalls, which we'll be discussing in today's presentation. We will now review the stages and resistance of change. Let's talk about the different stages of change. Any organizational change is composed of three distinct phases: the current state, the transition state, and the future state. The first stage, called current state, is the first step of a change. At this stage, organizations are still following their current operational model. However, a need for change has been highlighted and is underway. People begin to identify what they're losing. They begin to determine what is being left behind, such as relationships, processes, team members, and so on. For this reason, people tend to experience a large array of emotions, with denial, anxiety, shock, and fear being commonly present. It is then important to be aware of this, to put in place strategies that successfully acknowledge the emotion people are going through. People often fear what they do not understand, so it is also critical at this stage to educate them about a positive future and to clearly communicate how their knowledge and skill will be essential in helping the organization get there. The transition state is the second stage of change. During this stage, the old is gone, but the new is not yet fully operational, making it a neutral zone. In this neutral zone, people tend to still be attached to their old ways. It may also not yet be fully clear to them what the new way will look like. This leads to people often feeling confused, uncertain, stressed, or even angry about the changes happening. You may also perceive that some people are resentful or skeptic towards the change initiative, and that morale and productivity are decreasing. Because of the uncertainty present at this stage, it is important to guide people throughout this period by putting in place frequent and regular communication messages to keep them aware of what is happening and what the end result of the change will look like. It is also critical to implement feedback processes to allow this individual to voice their concerns, worries, and questions, and to also engage and make them contribute to the change initiative. Finally, the third stage of change, called future state, is characterized by a new beginning. At this stage, people have begun to accept and commit to the change. They are learning new skills and knowledge needed to efficiently perform within the new state of the organization and are beginning to see early achievements following their efforts. This leads to people to be more accepting of the change and also more energized and enthusiastic about it. At this stage, it is important to sustain this energy and sustain the change adoption. Putting in place frequent learning initiatives, sharing success stories related to the change, and aligning individual goals to the organization are key for this to happen. So remember, people go through different stages during change, and it is important to not rush them to the next one. Instead, the focus should be on putting in place strategies to support them and to help them navigate each different step of that change to ensure the best possible outcomes. Now, let's talk about some forms of resistance to change that you may face during the three stages we just talked about. Some of the most common ones are, first, immediate criticism. You will see this resistance being present when you see people being against the change initiative before even learning about what it is or what it entails. Another form of resistance is confusion, which will show by people not fully understanding or realizing what is being changed. You also have denial, like we talked about, where some people will simply refuse to accept the change even while it is happening. Malicious compliance is another one, where individuals seem to agree with the change and support it, but ultimately they do not comply or engage with it. Another resistance that is similar to confusion is easy agreement, where people will agree with the change happening, but they do not completely understand what they're agreeing with or what it will lead to. Sabotage is another form of resistance that is often present, where individuals are taking deliberate actions to impede or obstruct the implementation of the change. Deflection, which occurs when people change topic when the change is being mentioned or discussed, and silence, which occurs when people simply do not provide any input or share their thought about the change, are also common indicators of change resistance. It is important to be aware and to identify when resistance to change is present or is likely to occur in an organization. Doing so allows you to put in place strategies to mitigate the impact of the resistance and to ensure the best possible change management outcomes. As we mentioned, when a change occurs, people go through different change stages and resistance to change may happen. It is then critical to listen to the people in your organization to understand better the stages they are currently in and if any change resistance is happening or is likely to happen. During the current state, when people let go of their old ways and learn about the new changes, you may hear some skepticism like, "This costs too much," or "This will never work," Or you may hear people in denial with words like, I just keep doing my job, or this will never go through anyway. If that is the case, make sure to document where the skepticism lies and to address it as needed in future communication. You may also hear people being really enthusiastic about the change, with them saying things like, this sounds great, or we've been waiting for this. Keep track of this individual to leverage them as part of the change effort to energize and explain to others the benefit of the change at a more local level. During the transition state, when people are beginning to explore new ways of doing things, you may hear people bargaining after trying on new processes, with words like, maybe I will just try this part. It is critical to reinforce positive behaviors to push people to keep on engaging with the new ways and to let go of the old ones. Other people may express their frustration with the change with words like, no one is listening to me. Make sure to put in place opportunity through feedback mechanism or town halls to hear people's concerns and to address them. Finally, during the future state, where people begin to fully engage in the new ways of doing things, you will often hear people trying on the new processes with, this isn't so bad, or it seems to be working. Then you may hear people beginning to accept these processes and the changes with, okay, this makes sense. And finally, you will hear people commit to the change with them saying things like, it works, or it is easier, better than it used to be, etc. Don't forget, it is critical to pay attention to what the people say in your organization. It is a key component in change management to ensure that proper initiatives are put in place as part of the change to mitigate potential risk and to better understand in which stage of the change the people in your organization are. This will give you important information to modify and adapt your change strategies to ensure that the best positive organizational change outcome occur.
So now let's move on into cultural factors and pitfalls. So let's try to understand diversity in a global context. First, what is workforce diversity? Workforce diversity refers in the division of the workforce into distinct categories. One, you could be in a category that have a perceived commonality within a given culture or national context, i.e., you speak the same language, or you could be from the same ethnicity or the same race. And then the other thing that you have to look into is that whether or not you fit into this category, that can either be harmful or beneficial to get employment or to get a job. And so that is irrespective of your job qualification or skill set. So why is a global perspective important? It is important because you may have different styles, working styles, communication styles. Also looking at the hierarchy, people and leadership, it's not the same if you're in Europe versus Americas, South America, Asia, Africa. The way people work is very different. So you really need to look at, the differences across cultures, the styles and personality. You need to look at also having a cross-cultural competency. So you need to be able to develop a global mindset. And by that, it's to try to understand how people work differently, listening, asking questions. On the other hand, make sure that you have as less as possible in terms of biases and not looking at stereotypes, because then can have impact on your performance and other, your colleagues' performance that may be working in different countries, different regions. I was just, talking about leadership and authority. It's very different, if you work in Europe versus, even Northern Europe versus Southern Europe. The hierarchy and the way, people lead may be very different, let alone if you look at Asia or Middle East. So you want to make sure that you develop that global mindset, trying to understand and listening and also reading to make sure that you have that global perspective so you can work effectively and communicate effectively with your colleagues. So this visual is explaining to you the organizational culture, so how people work depending on the culture of the company, whether you're in a global mindset or not. And so you need to look at the beliefs around strategy and business model. So that's looking at the strategy of the company, what is the operating model, so how people work, how are the departments are organized, and what are the values, right? And then you need to look at the behaviors and personal interactions. So how is the leadership in that company? What are the behavioral styles and interpersonal dynamics? And finally, you need to look at how the decisions are being made. And so from there, you're looking at what are the decision-making practices, what are the company policies and processes. And sometimes you know that sometimes you can be in an organization where they're very into consensus, and so to make a decision can take a long time. And in some organization, it could be very authoritarian. So at the leadership level, they make a decision and that's it. The rest of the company, the employees need to follow. So all those three different categories then and combine under the culture. And you need to add a layer around the global, having that global mindset, working in a global environment. And you can have some sub layers of culture based on where the company is. And so you can have a culture in North America for the same company and then have a subculture, let's say in India. And so you need to make sure that you pay attention to that as you work through global projects, because again, in terms of communications, leadership, decision making, things might be quite different. So I really like this visual. It shows you how people work depending on different countries and then categories. And so on this one, we only have 4 countries. As you can see, we have Germany, France, China, and Japan. But then the different categories are around how people communicate, evaluation, leadership, deciding, trusting, disagreeing, scheduling, and persuading. And as you can see, you have 2 countries in Europe, which is Germany and France, and 2 countries in Asia with China and Japan. But still, depending on the different categories, they're absolutely not at the same style, right? So if you just look at communication, so for communicating, in Germany, you can see it's very low context toward the left-hand side, whereas for France, even France, China, and Japan, very high context. When you look at leadership, for France and Germany, they're very close, so right in the middle, whereas for Japan and China, it's very hierarchical, right? And so on. So you can look at this. It's pretty, again, this is coming from HBR. And it depends on the culture. I like to look at also the time around scheduling. For many countries, for instance, in Africa, it's very much so around flexible time. So we will be on the right-hand side. And you can see same here for China. But for Japan and Germany, it's very linear. So when there's a meeting scheduled, people are on time. They show up on time. They finish most of the time on time, right? But if you work with, your colleagues that are based out of Africa, or in this case, as you can see, China, people may not be necessarily on time. And so that's something that you need to take into consideration when you work in a global environment and you're trying to, implement a change, and you want to make sure that you look at those different, specificities around communication, leadership, again, scheduling, timing, and so on. So now let's talk about the common change management pitfalls. And those are no matter you are working on the global project and not. And then I will dive into change management pitfalls in a global environment. So first is the people planning lags, or in planning efforts. Most of the time, from our experience, when you go into an organization who's going through a transformation, organizations are very proactive and vigilant around finances, budgeting, operations, and so on. And they leave, or they even flat out forget about the people planning side of things. And so there's a huge risk here because, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but they don't really do a stakeholder analysis, try to understand the impact on the people. And they just focus on the budget, operations, and so on. And then you may have people coming in and literally sabotage, your change management efforts because the people planning was not there at the beginning of a project. And then the second one here is the role of managers that is underestimated, and especially the middle management, because managers are, as it's written here, often the glue, right? They're the link between the leadership and the frontline and staff employee level. And so if you don't pay attention to the middle management, it's gonna be really, really hard to manage, a change. And so if you want to make sure that to have a successful implementation, whereas it's a system implementation, or org design, or no matter process changes and so on, you want to make sure that you involve the middle management so they can communicate the change and be the voice for frontline staff, and then talk to the leadership to make sure that there's mitigation strategies to make sure that the change will stick. Then there's one that's pretty straightforward. It's around communication. So communication is absolutely key. You want to make sure that you communicate to the right people at the right time, explaining the why, so people can understand, what's coming, the what, the when, the how. You want to make sure that also the leadership and the sponsorship are there and they can, communicate the vision and the benefits of the change. Otherwise, again, it's going to be really hard to, manage the change. The next category is around the individual agendas that are being ignored, and that's the WIFM, also called the what's in it for me. And so people need to understand as an employee, as an individual level, what's in it for me? Why should I change? Why should I change my behavior? Why should I, do things differently from point A to point B, or from the current state to the future state, as, Thomas mentioned earlier before, because otherwise it will be really, really hard to make people change and embrace the change of whatever transformation you're trying to achieve. Last but not least is around engagement not being measured. Anything related to data and KPIs. So metrics are not established at the beginning of the project, and then it's really hard to either monitor or look at the success rate, and it's hard to then again go back and have some mitigation strategies. And this one is actually very often overlooked. So you want to make sure that as soon as you start, going through that change management journey, make sure that you have, metrics established, and very often throughout the transformation or the change or the system implementation, you want to make sure that you measure success. Are you reaching your goals? So you can, move forward and get employees engaged. So now, what are the nuances of, the common change management pitfalls in a global context? So first, representation and involvement in the planning stage. You want to make sure that, you want to involve all the countries or regions into the planning process. Oftentimes, let's say the transformation or the change is being initiated, let's say in the US, some organization may not talk or, involve all the parts of the organization that are in, I don't know, let's say in Asia or in the Middle East. And that can create vulnerability and risks of resistance because we don't know and we didn't involve, other regions and other countries where the company is. The second one is around leadership and decision making. As I mentioned earlier, depending on where you are, decisions are being made very differently. So in autocratic cultures like those of Latin America or even in France or the Middle East, decisions tend to come from the top. So as I mentioned earlier, at the leadership level or even senior executive level, decisions are being made and then the rest of the company, the rest of the employees, they just have to follow. Whereas in other countries where you have more of a flatter management style, like the Netherlands, Australia, Israel, consensus is very important. So it might take more time, but you want to make sure that you involve people at different level of the organizations. The decisions may not just come from the top. People will not follow through. So you want to make sure that you involve, again, employees from different levels. Whereas if you work on a project with, within a country like France or Middle East, maybe not. People will just follow the orders. Then it's around communications. So it most of the time, in global projects, English is the language that's being used. But even though, we're all speaking the same language, you may have some cross-cultural misunderstanding. And English may not be the first language for a lot of us. So you want to make sure that, you speak slowly, you listen, and you pay attention to cross-cultural, differences so that there's no miscommunication. Last but not least is around time management. Again, as I mentioned earlier, depending on the country where you are, it can be very different. So if you're looking at the linear time, we focus mostly on the deadline and you need to stick to the schedule. You start on time, there's a deadline, you need to finish on time. You better be, prompt, on time, etc. So those are, within culture or countries like Germany, Japan, or even Switzerland. Then you have, on the other hand, flexible time, where tasks can change as opportunities arise. And so in countries like India, Nigeria, or even Saudi Arabia, it's okay if things are, times can change, right? Deadlines may be changed. People may not be right, on time at the start of the meeting, and it's okay. But if you do that in, linear time, countries, it might be perceived very negatively.
Now that we have talked about cultural factors and different change management pitfalls, let's review some best practices. When conducting any change management initiatives, it is first important to have a clear vision and strategy for the change. This is done by ensuring that the need for change is well defined, with a clear understanding of its necessity, and with a clear understanding of what will come out of it. A concise plan to implement it should also be developed that includes the different activities that must take place, like communication messages that need to be shared, or trainings that must be conducted. Leadership at all levels should also be aligned and clearly understand the change as they will be critical for its implementation. When implementing global changes, be aware of local practices and how they may affect the change. Pay attention to what typically increase engagement in different locations, as well as the leadership and management style preferred, and adapt your plan to it. In addition, make sure that the local leadership in the impacted locations are aware and understand the change. Their alignment will be important to promote the change locally and for them to be accountable for it. Another best practice of change management is to have clear and frequent communication using tools that are appropriate for the audience being targeted. The information shared should be available to all individuals impacted by the change, and there should be processes in place to obtain their perception and concerns related to the change. When conducting a global initiative, it is critical for communication messages to be translated in local languages. The way communication is shared should also be adapted to local practices for better engagement. In the same logic, feedback mechanisms should be implemented in all locations, and the information obtained should be tracked to better understand the specific needs of different groups and to develop plans to meet these needs locally. For a change to be rolled out successfully, it is important to empower teams, and this is even more critical for changes happening on a global scale. Empowering key individuals to be involved in the decision-making process and in the implementation of the change will make them more committed to it and will promote knowledge sharing and local ownership. A common best practice is to implement change agents, as so-called change champions, to be a local point of contact for others to learn about the change and to share their feedback. When implementing an initiative on a global scale, it is important to have change agents representing all the different impacted groups and locations. If this is not done, some groups may perceive being left out or that their point of view does not matter as much as others, which could have negative consequences on the change effort and its successful implementation. Finally, it is important to reward and recognize individuals' accomplishment and new behaviors aligned with the change being implemented. Doing so will make individuals feel appreciated for their contribution and will promote others to engage in similar behaviors, which will positively support the implementation of the change. When conducting global changes, make sure that all individuals are being rewarded and that no group are being left out. In addition, make sure to adapt the reward and recognition practices to local norms for them to have the expected effect. Let's talk about a few other best practices when working on change initiative in a global context. Wherever we come from, or whatever our background may be, we all have unconscious processes that have been internalized and that we're not always aware of. These unconscious processes shape our way of thinking and our actions. When working on a global context, it is important to understand what these processes are and when they occur, to identify them early on and to mitigate their effects when implementing some type of change. When preparing for the change, spend time with the different groups to understand the dynamics that exist within the organization you're working with. Be aware that these unconscious processes will differ from one group to another, and make sure to understand how they will impact all the other stakeholder groups involved in the change. As we talked about when reviewing the different stages of change, people experience a lot of emotions when going through a transition. It is important for people to feel safe to let these emotions out and to discuss their feelings. This will help them go through the current state to the future state of the change. When working on a change happening on a global scale, change management practitioners must remember that the display of emotion varies drastically between cultures, with, for example, Americans and Western Europeans displaying their emotion more openly than Eastern and Asian cultures. Practitioners must understand that emotions will be shown in different manners and at different intensity levels. Another best practice when working on global change management initiative is to understand the societal and historical context happening. It is important to not jump on conclusion and to wrongly assess a process or outcome to happen because of one group or one individual culture. Instead, it is important to examine the process or outcome with a social and historical lens. Change practitioners should assess the external factors currently happening that are specific to the different cultures and locations that are impacted by the change. This will avoid making wrong assumptions on the potential source of the challenge and will allow to put in place a better strategy to ensure its mitigation and a successful change. Finally, change practitioners should understand how power and authority vary in different cultures. As we discussed previously, leadership and management style vary drastically based on cultural expectation of how decisions are made, communicated, and implemented. When working on a global context, change management practitioners must understand these differences to make sure that they involve all the needed stakeholders in the decision-making process and in the implementation process. They must also ensure that the change is communicated and implemented locally in the most appropriate ways based on local practices and preferred leadership styles. Practitioners will also need to assess who holds power in the different locations impacted by the change and ensures involvement and alignment of these leaders.
So now let's go ahead and talk about our case study. First of all, the client. So our client was a medical technology provider. It was a global company with over 10,000 employees serving clients, hospitals and clinics all over the world. And they essentially provided medical equipment as well as software and digital health products to their clients. So the project was a change management support on a vendor management system. So it was a global project where, as a change management team, we were there to prepare for the implementation of a new procurement system and provide the adequate support to the change prior, during, and after its implementation. The key stakeholders were the executive leadership, the Vice President of Global Sourcing and Supplier Management, the Vice President of Business Operations, of course, end users, project team, and as well the vendors. So the scope was again to ensure that employees were getting the buy-in and driving adoption and managing organizational readiness, more specifically changes to business processes, systems, and technology, job roles, capability, requirements, and organizational structures were to make sure that people were able to manage the resistance to change. Deliverables were stakeholder analysis, communications plan, messages, and a change agent network. The first thing we did was a stakeholder analysis. So compared to a normal stakeholder analysis that you would do for a local project, in this case, what we did from a global perspective was to involve all impacted regions, looking at key individual stakeholders as well as departments and functions, looking at the degree of impact, the level of influence, and assessing their level of support at that particular stage, so we could see what key actions were needed and approach to make sure that they would move from awareness to all the way to committed to the change. So of course we also looked at cultural nuances across all regions, so they were different compared to looking at North America versus Europe, for instance. We had some nuances. So then we worked on our communications strategy. Communication strategy was looking at first getting the strategic objectives, then the scope with the functional geographical scope, where what was impacted, what type of department and geographic regions were impacted, and then what from the stakeholder analysis we also had a change impact assessment and audience and channel analysis that helped us to create our communication strategy, looking at our different stakeholder groups and where their level of engagement, going from awareness to desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. So we used the ATCAR model from ProSci, and based on that, we looked at where they needed to be based on the timing. And so again, from a global perspective, the nuance here was to look at all the impacted group from all different countries, taking into consideration the local policies and regulations, because for instance, some regions had unions and the way we had to communicate with them was different compared to, for instance, North America. Then we built our communications plan and calendar. And so we all know communications plan is the what, the when, the how, and the who. But the nuance here, compared to when you look at a local project, is we had to translate the messages into local languages. And so before we were involved with the project, they were planning on, just sending communications in English, not looking into the, nuances from different countries. And so we used our, project team and different stakeholders to translate into local languages. So, and that went a long way because, as I mentioned earlier, that's a best practice to translate messaging, presentation, and also doing those key presentation, looking at the benefits of the change and the what's in it for me into local languages, so people would really relate and understand, the key impact they would have based on, the system implementation we had for this project. So this is absolutely key. Make sure that you translate into local languages so people can absolutely relate and understand what's coming. Another key tool we used was to set a change agent network. And that's a really good practice you can do, because especially when you work on a global environment or a global project, you make sure that you have representation from all locations, all countries. And so, as I mentioned, a change agent network is set to have people and representation from key locations, key departments at different level of organization, so they can relate key messages from the project team and the leadership team, but also be the voice and can hear what's going on at the location from the frontline staff. And so they're basically a liaison between the project team, leadership team, and the employees. And so their role was to be able to raise awareness, support the change, and then making sure that the adoption, and as I mentioned earlier, with the key metrics, making sure that people were engaged and using this new tool. And so they also helped with the translation of messages and presentation into local languages. And it's not just translating, it's also making sure that we would, make some tweaks into the presentation so we could, literally make sure that people would understand and be engaged into this transformation and this vendor management system. Our key takeaways from the global change management pitfalls and best practices is to, one, develop a cultural intelligence. So make sure that you have the attitude, awareness, knowledge, and skills to, navigate and implement change management best practices in a global context. So from an attitude perspective, make sure that your mindset and approach to interacting with people from different culture is positive. Try to understand and listen, to people that may not look like you, speak like you, and communicate the way you're used to. Then we're looking at awareness. That's your ability to recognize and understand the impact of cultural differences on behavior, communications, and decision making. Is tied to the first one, right? So you want to make sure that you, again, understand differences on how people communicate, how they make decisions, how they behave based on the country or region. Then you have the knowledge. So that's understanding, again, different cultural practices, policies, customs, values, and beliefs. And so a perfect example is when, you're going through a program or a project, make sure that you understand that there's some holidays, for instance, that may happen. So we're talking, for instance, for the Middle East, when it's Ramadan, people finish work earlier. They have, the holiday called Eid, which is, they have their day off, or they don't even work on Fridays, right? They have Fridays and Saturdays off. So if you're working on a global implementation or a global project, you have customs and holidays based on religions that may be absolutely different from where you are. So you need to have that understanding and that knowledge. Finally, you have also the skills. So you need to be able to navigate different cultural contexts and effectively communicate and work with people from diverse cultural backgrounds. So that's that empathy, right? Making sure that you're aware, and you have that skill set to be able to navigate different cultural contexts. So at the end of the day, you need to be able to understand your own perspective, but you need to also be able to recognize that it's normal, that your normal is not necessarily the normal for others. And it's okay to make mistakes, but make sure that you have that empathy and that understanding and seeking for knowledge to understand different cultural norms, and the way that people communicate, so you can work accordingly and in a global context. So this was Global Change Management Pitfalls and Best Practices, presented by Miriam Huss and Thomas Tischer. Feel free to reach out to us. You have our emails at the end of the presentation, or you can also visit our website, axamconsulting.com, to learn more about what we do. Thank you very much and have a great day.